Please welcome OpenUK's CEO, Amanda Brock.
Good morning, Prague. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Prague for the first time since lockdown. And in fact, to be on a stage in Prague for the first time in almost 20 years. I doubt anybody in this room knows that I used to work here around 20 years ago, pre-accession. And I worked for an electrical retailer, a company called Dixons in the UK. We set up something called Electro World here in Prague, in Zličin. And we sold computers for under 300 euros for the first time in this country. And I'll never forget, on our opening day, the highways of Prague came to a standstill for the first time since the Velvet Revolution. We made the 6 o'clock news here in the city. I doubt very much that the content of my talk today is going to have quite the same impact on the city, but I do hope that you'll take away a few things about open source and whether or not it's going to fail. So for the last 3 years, I've been CEO of OpenUK, but my background is as a lawyer. And 15 years ago, almost exactly, I joined an open source software company in the UK, Canonical. Canonical, you may all know, I was employee 185. It's much, much bigger today, and it's the commercial sponsor of the Ubuntu operating system. Since then, I've been very engaged in open source software, also open hardware and open data, but primarily software. And I have had a number of different roles as a member of the community, one of them being with the United Nations, where I chaired their Technology Innovation Labs. I have a government appointment in the UK with the Cabinet Office, with the Open Standards Board. And last year, I was elected to the Open Source Initiative Board. And the OSI is the custodian of the licensing, the custodian of the open source definition. For my sins, I edited a book. It was a difficult 5-year process, to be quite honest. It's 640 pages long. I suspect I'm going to be the only person in the history of open source who reads that book cover to cover 5 times anyway. But you'll find, if you're particularly interested in the hardware space, that the second last chapter by Andrew Katz, who is the world-leading authority in open hardware licensing, might be right up your street. We launched the book in All Things Open, an open source conference in Raleigh, North Carolina, in October last year. And we launched it with 6 different female authors on a panel. And that panel, unexpectedly, went viral on the Chinese internet. Who knew? So the book has now been translated into Mandarin, and it will be published there later this year. So I do academic writing, I do tech press writing, and I do a lot of this. I travel the world speaking at conferences like this. And often what I'm doing is explaining open source software. Back when I joined Canonical 15 years ago, it was really, really difficult to get open source software, open hardware was sort of a vision, adopted. And what we found was that there were barriers, risk-based barriers, compliance-based barriers, and they came from procurement, they came from legal, and they came from finance, because people needed approval to bring open source into their industry, into their businesses. And I think it's really important to understand what open source software is. And open source software is software where the source code is made available, and that source code is distributed on an OSI-approved license. To be in an OSI-approved license, it needs to comply with the open source definition. And we're lucky to have a definition, although even that compliance can be debated in our space. For me, principles 5 and 6 are the critical ones. No discrimination against persons or group, so no discrimination against people, available for everyone to use for any purpose. And any purpose is no discrimination against field of endeavor, 6. On the open hardware side, we don't have quite the same definition, but I recommend the book chapter to help you with that. We also need to be thinking about open silicon and how that works. Now, we see today a very different marketplace. Between 48 and 98% of any software that you see today is going to be open source. That percentage depends on the surveys you look at, it depends on the stack you're talking about. And that's because of a shift. And there's been a massive shift away from open source being blocked by those procurement, those legal, and those finance people because of digital transformation and digitalization. And what we see is the role of the engineer elevated in organizations. As a company becomes digital, it needs its engineering function to support it, and the engineers start to become decision makers. For the software side, we see Git. We see Git as a tool and the repositories that allow collaborative working, distributed working like GitHub, GitLab. We see them making it accessible and easy for those engineers to bring the software into their organizations. And we see cloud. Cloud is built on open source. There's no denying it, particularly the public cloud. And what we see is companies shifting from that contract base to thinking about their policies and their processes around open. And we see Microsoft as a great example. So Microsoft was one of the biggest opponents when I joined Canonical to open source software. Today, it's the single biggest contributor in the world to open source software. So what makes that shift? Steve Wally, my friend, Steve Wally was speaking in Edinburgh in 2018, keynoting the Open Source Summit there. And he explains that Microsoft's shift isn't altruistic. He explains it's for 3 reasons. Firstly, anybody who's learned to code in the last 20 years is going to use open source. They just are. It's the way that they work. And if you want to hire them, which most people do today, you have to allow them to develop in an open way, to recycle, to reuse, to collaborate. The second thing Steve says is that we now today see technology, particular innovations, things like containerizations that customers want that are only available open source. I just left Amsterdam last night where there are 10,000 open source software developers at KubeCon. This is permeating our society. It's the backbone of it. If you want to run a cloud business, you don't just use the open source software, you have to engage with those communities, you have to be part of it to have influence. And then the third thing that Microsoft say is that the customers today really want that software. So you've got the engineers, they want to use it. You've got the customers who are asking you for it, and to run a cloud business, you need it. And what we're seeing is sector by sector, they're following that journey that Microsoft has been on. They're following that shift. At MWC this year, we saw the GSMA launch Gateway, their open API project. And many companies like Nokia and Rakuten also made open source announcements. In the public sector, the UK's had a leading position, and for the last 11 years, we've had an open first strategy. That became really apparent, not just in the UK, but globally through lockdown, when we saw the test and trace apps across the world open sourced. But it's not just that front end, it's not just that user-facing piece. We also see the backbone, the infrastructure, our national critical infrastructure being built in open source. So obviously we've won, but now what? Well, when open source comes into a marketplace, it disrupts, and that disruption often affects revenue generation. So you can understand that there's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of pushback from the disrupted. Nobody likes to lose revenue. And as a consequence of that, we see a lot of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And it's still a problem for us today across many different areas. We may have won a battle, but we've certainly not won the war. And what we see is things like concerns about that infrastructure, that critical infrastructure being built on open source software. We see security concerns. I was just backstage reading an article this morning about open hardware and security. First one I've seen, very good. We see standards. I was pleased to hear George calling for more open standards on which we base our future. And we see geopolitical shift. We see governments who are not so keen on collaboration across the globe, which is at the heart of everything we do in the open source spaces. And that geopolitical shift can have massive, massive impact. We see things like the war in Ukraine even with protests were trying to restrict people's usage, trying to restrict the purpose of the usage against those fundamental principles I mentioned at the start, principles 5 and 6 of the open source definition. So, we've won, but can we make our future sustainable? In the UK, the way we've been doing that is through OpenUK, the organisation I run. And we do it through the 3 opens. John Laban, I believe, isn't here today, but I know many of you know him. And John christened these as the 3 opens in our first board meeting. John's one of our directors. Open source software, open hardware, and open data. And we believe that the 3 opens are necessary for the future. We bring together a leadership community to build a cohesive voice, and we do that by celebrating them through awards, through honours lists, through bringing them together in events. We use their power, we use their collective voice in our geography to influence law and policy, responding to legislation in the UK and abroad, and building reports. These are our first reports from 2021, where we cut the data for the UK for the first time. We looked at case studies across the UK, and we started to tell stories that the policymakers, the governments, and the business people could understand. In 2022, we used some of the data to demonstrate some key facts. If you look at that top left one, you'll see the amount we estimate was invested in the UK in open source software. So for the UK, that's 5 times the amount that was put into the Digital Recovery Fund and the Levelling Up Fund for tech. 5 times, quite incredible. We've also been very involved in the sustainability agenda. And we had one of the biggest events at COP26 2 years ago. This year we're hosting an event in Edinburgh on the 14th of September, sponsored by Intel, where we'll look more at the work we did before for COP26 and the work that we're doing now for COP28. At COP26, we launched something called Patchwork Kilt, the data center of the future, using open technologies, bringing together a blueprint for open source software, hardware, data. I loved what I just heard before I came on stage, and we already have a lot of OCP included in this project, and I hope to see more of you engaging with us. Initially, this community was being built by the Eclipse Foundation, but we've taken that back into OpenUK, and we're building it out for COP28. We also have an EV charging blueprint setting out the various aspects of open technology and EV charging. Security is high up the agenda. I've mentioned it already. It's a great challenge in open source. It's a challenge also in open hardware. And last year, we launched our first summer of open source software security. We will do a second this year, which we should broaden to cover hardware too, I realize. And that was very recognized as one of the 8 key initiatives. So we bring our community together. We use their voice to have influence, and we build skills, we build learning. We do that for children, we do it for business people. We're working with Strathclyde University's Entrepreneurship School, and later this year we'll launch a MOOC, a massive open online course. And all of this drives to our purpose to meet this challenge around open technology. For us in the UK, we want to develop UK leadership. I'm sure you all want to do that in your own countries. But we also want to do it on a collaborative global basis. We're an organisation that's tiny. We have 2 full-time staff, but we have around 130 people, many of whom I know you'll recognise, working as our board, our leadership team, our ambassadors, helping us with different meaty problems that we tackle, and helping advise us. And right now, we've just launched 2 new advisory boards, one on AI and one on quantum, if anybody's interested in helping us. And in doing all of this, we've created a very, very different organisation. At the heart of it, we think there is a sense of belonging. That culminated in our conference, our first annual conference in London in February. We had just under 800 attendees, and incredibly, 88.3% of those who signed up attended. Now that could have been because OCP ran the hardware track for us, I'm not sure. What we also had was almost half our speakers who weren't men. When we look at our delegates, 1/3 of our delegates were women, and 49.7% weren't white. Something that I'm sure you all want to encourage, but something we rarely see in tech. So how are we going to build this future? How are we going to meet the challenge of whether open source will fail? Well, I'd ask that we collaborate more. I've mentioned that OCP hosted our hardware track. I hope they'll do it again next year, and that we can do more collaboration. Collaboration in events, collaboration in projects, collaboration in teaching. And I hope you'll work with us to understand curation, the good technical hygiene, and the good governance of open source. Collectively, we see responses have more impact when we deal with government. This morning, 13 open source companies submitted something to the European Commission on the Cyber Resilience Act and the problems that it will have in open source software. George talked to you about open standards. Collaboratively, we should build more of those. And we must demonstrate our value. We must demonstrate our value to other enterprises and to governments. Back in 2021, we released these details of open source software in the UK. You can see at 43.15 billion going up to 46.5 billion with a bit of tinkering, direct contribution to GDP. That will only go up over time. We need governments to understand that as they use more and more open source software, open hardware and open data, that they need to contribute. And that contribution should take the form of recognizing the opens, recognizing open source as a digital public good. And today we hope to share with you, it could be tomorrow, but I'm really hoping it's today, our latest phase 1 report for the state of open, the UK in 2023. And one of the key things that we're going to draw out in that report is the position of the UK in Europe. In terms of open source software, we're number 1 in Europe. We're number 1 by the number of contributions made, the number of developers, and we're number 5 in the world. That probably surprises most of you because it's not something our government, it's not something our policymakers or our businesses talk about enough. And what we've demonstrated in this report, working with GitHub, is that in the UK we have over 3 million GitHub account holders. That's 4.5% of the UK population has a GitHub account, more than any country in the world, and I think you'll agree, quite incredible. So my messaging to you today is, will open source fail? There are many, many challenges. There's a great deal of FUD, and if we want it to be there and to shine bright for our future, that will only happen through collaboration and working together. Thank you.